This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale and today I'm going to be talking to Joseph Aisenberg, who has written a fascinating study on Brian De Palma's Stephen King adaptation Carrie. We'll be going into the film quite deeply and into the book, available on Kindle if you follow the link in the show notes. I also wanted to mention that over the next month or so I'm going to be very busy with film festivals. I'm going to a bunch of them, covering them for Variety and other outlets, so I shall be... Maybe the time of the podcast will slip a little bit. If by any chance there are gaps, I'm going to try and plug them by reissuing some old episodes, which I don't think have had the love that they deserve. So apologies for that in advance, although if you haven't listened to the old episodes, you might be quite relieved of the opportunity to have a chance to catch up on something you haven't had an opportunity to listen to before. Before you go, listen to our conversation with me and Joseph Aisenberg.
I'm not really sure what my first experiences were with cinema. It seems like the first favorite movie I had when I was like 5 years old was like The Sound of Music. That's pretty much, I mean, it's like born in Oklahoma. My mom and dad had a very stormy relationship. They got divorced, and then Sound of Music is probably my favorite film. And then sometime around 10 years old, like they started doing UHF channels. I don't know if you know what those are, but these weren't like the regular network TV channels. And so to fill the void, they would just show old movies constantly. And so I got into old movies when I was like 10 years old. So anything that was made before like 1960, I was on it.
Wow, that's your university of cinema then?
Yeah, it was basically, TV, UHF TV. Then, of course, VCRs happened, and I got into those. And for a long time, I was kind of prissy and didn't really like modern films that much because I was raised very Christian, too. That's another thing. So I was so movies seemed very dirty to me. But then, of course, after I hit 50 or 60, I was like, bring on the film. And then started really getting into the film. And it's kind of funny because, the 70s is now really kind of considered the golden age of film, or in America anyway. And but in the 80s and the 70s just seemed like such a joke to people my age. Gen X, we were teens then, and it's just like the stupid hair and the platform shoes and all that disco and stuff. And it wasn't until probably after Tarantino really that you started going back and going, wow, these 70s movies were real weird and screwed up and interesting.
I remember just thinking like flared trousers and disco. Ugh.
Right, exactly, yeah. And then in the early 70s, around the time that Tarantino started to become big, then people started doing the 70s. And there's three phases of 70s. There was the early 90s 70s, and then a mid to late 90s 70s. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, then you go back and you see these Altman films, and you see of course Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets, and you're like, in the 80s, movies were just so bland and formulaic for the most part, except for, the occasional David Lynch or the Terry Gilliam or something like that. And then you get something really interesting, but nothing like what they were doing for 5 or 6 years in the 70s.
Yeah, and I think the thing in the 70s is it was major studios were doing it as well. It wasn't just you weren't having to go to an underground independent American director to get your jollies. You could get them via Francis Ford Coppola. And
they didn't have to put a whole lot of money into it. It wasn't really until after Spielberg with Jaws that they were like, we're just going to pour all the money we can into it to get giant hits. So you can just, pour a few $1 million into a movie and it would be a big hit, and they could do all kinds of weird, disturbing stuff, and people would flock to see it.
Yeah, it's kind of like when I read the first reactions to things like Jaws and Star Wars, the initial reception was, this is an anomaly. This is so crazy that this has happened. We released a film in the summer and it was huge. How did that work?
I know, that's weird.
And then they kind of make it into, no, that's the formula. That's what we're going to do. But it was a kind of lucky strike when it first happened.
Right, but we were I was probably 5 or 6 when Jaws came out, so it kind of seemed like it was always that. And I didn't realize that kind of started that. And of course, Star Wars happened, and Of course I was big on that, but that was one of those things where, see, I felt like we should have grew out of Star Wars. And it's weird to me that people are still seeing them and that they want to see weird, serious versions of them like that. What's that one that the critics just love, The Last Jedi? The Last Jedi or something, right? And it's just this huge, glossy colossus that's so self-serious. And you're just like, why would they do this? At least like the first one, I'm not that big on Star Wars, but at least it's kind of got a little clunky comic charm to it. It's not like, also like, what happened to the Force, man? Like the last time I watched a Star Wars movie, because I hadn't watched any of these new ones until The Last Jedi, because the critics just, I want to be mean about this, but they just jizzed all over it, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, now the Force can bring you back to life, and the Force can project your soul all the way across the universe and do fake versions of you. And I'm like, I remember when it was just like a little telekinesis, and no, yeah, a little telekinesis, and you could like read minds maybe. Oh, and a ghost could sort of appear to you, but you could still die.
Yeah.
Now you can't even die. No one died.
Absolutely.
Like, what is that?
Whatever the script needs is what the Force can do.
And the only reason Carrie Fisher died is because she died in real life. Like in the movie, she gets blown out into space and she uses the Force to suck herself back into a spaceship and brings herself back to life. And I'm like, no, I refuse.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in Superman territory. Superman, spinning around the world and turning back time territory.
All right. Speaking of a thing that was an unusual thing at the time, and now it's just everything's.
Well, I mean, speaking of your, when you were mentioning your background earlier, obviously the thing that pinged with me is that we're going to discuss today your book on Carrie, the Stephen King adaptation by Brian De Palma, and for many people, arguably the best Stephen King adaptation, certainly of that first bunch. How did you come across the film and the book? Was it which one came first for you?
Okay, it was the movie first, and I was like, it was probably when it was first showed on TV, and I remember nothing about the film except for the end when Carrie's hand comes out of the grave and grabs them. And I was watching with my brother and sister then, and that happened, and then they just screamed. It went screaming in horror to my grandparents' bedroom, and they had to sleep with them for a week. And then later, a friend of mine watched it on VHS, and this was still when I was kind of coming out of the Christian upbringing I had, which kind of connects with Margaret White, I guess, because my mom is very fundamentalist. And I was like, well, this is filthy. And then later, after high school, the shell shock of high school, I saw it a couple of years after that, and I saw it again at a college campus because I live in a college town. And I went and saw it at one of the English department showings of it, and I was just blown away. Actually, do you know the movie Sisters?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I've seen that. At first, I kind of dismissed De Palma as like your regular Hitchcock ripoff, like people often say. And then I saw Sisters, and I just thought that was the coolest movie. And I'd watch it over and over again. So then when Carrie showed, I thought I would give that a shot again. And then I just thought that was amazing and thought it was technically better, although I really still love Sisters a lot.
Yeah, Sisters is I hesitate to say underrated because I think Brian De Palma is staging a big comeback at the moment. I think he's being reassessed.
I felt like after I did, because by the time I wrote my Carrie book, I felt like he was not very appreciated. Because I wrote the book in 2009, and then it seemed like almost immediately after that, Carrie's reputation came back up again. And now people really like, which I'm really glad about. Maybe I helped. I hope.
So when did you read the book then? Did you read the book afterwards So
I read the book, let's see, I watched it on VHS, and then a year later, because a friend of mine that made me watch it on VHS, he really loves Stephen King, and so he had me read the book. And at first I really liked the book more than the movie until I resaw it again. And then I was like, then I went back and reread the book because I loved the movie so much. And I was like, I think this movie's better than the book. And then I read the book then, and then I read it mostly just because I wanted to have more of the movie.
Yeah, controversial opinion I have that Stephen King makes the films based on his books are so good because of the weakness of the books sometimes. There's, The Shining, I think, is an amazing movie. The book, I think, is good, but
Yeah.
there are weaknesses in the book that the movie kind of improves vastly.
Well, it's interesting because they have different, like Kubrick has and De Palma too, to a certain degree, they have different talents. Like, I think the talent that Stephen King has is with character, right? So it's like when he gives you the character of Jack Torrance in the book, it's very compelling. The alcoholism, how he almost beat his kid, the terrible marriage that he and his wife have. But the weakness, I think, is it's in a couple of places. One is that I think there's a certain derivative quality to his use of the supernatural elements. Like, you can just feel where he's pulling from everything. And he was writing really, really fast. Like, you have to remember, like, that's like a 400 something page book. And if you're to believe his interviews, he had to have written that book in 2.5 weeks. Do you know what I mean? He was writing 10,000 words a day, according to him. And so there's technical logical flaws in the book that are not in the movie. Like, for instance, there's still kind of one in the movie too, which is, but you know how in the movie and in the book, I don't know if you remember, the ghost of Grady lets Jack out of that food pantry.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if he can do that, in the book, there's a thing with a boiler that blows up, and Jack is chasing down Danny, and then he realizes he has to get back to that boiler and let out the steam. And you're like, no, he doesn't. Grady can just go down there and do it himself. Right? Yeah. But that's something you wouldn't think of if you wrote it in 2 weeks. And so Kubrick, of course, has taken all that silliness out and has come up with a whole new way to do supernaturalism in it. It's like this weird, blinkless, hypnotic, kind of like overlit staring thing that he does. And whereas De Palma in the film of Carrie, he has much more of an interest in style and in like split perspectives and in division to like keep pulling your focus to different places. And also, like, he really wanted Carrie's power to be like a poltergeist, right? Whereas Stephen King wants it to be this deliberate thing that she exercises and uses. And I think that really changes a lot of it. And I think they both have more of an interest in style, and I think that heightens the effectiveness of the supernatural elements in both Kubrick and De Palma. Whereas I think really Stephen King is a character writer and likes melodrama. That's my take.
I absolutely agree with the melodrama bit. I mean, especially the ending of The Shining, where it's sort of like, Danny, save yourself. And he sort of sacrifices himself and beats himself to death with a croquet mallet, you know? And it's just like...
And by the way, like, speaking of that, I don't know if you remember, a weird thing in the book too is that Wendy manages to kill Jack at one point. And in the scene in the movie where he's like pushing her up the stairs and then she hits him and he gets knocked out. But in the book, she stabbed him in the back with a knife. And then he gets back up and is like, you killed me. And then goes after her. And you're like, again, if the hotel can do all that, then what's the whole point to why it needs Danny? It's like there's a logic. Because like, I'm not sure that Stephen King thought through the logic of what is the point to what the hotel's doing. Like, it seems like the unwritten idea is that Danny's got the psychic power, and if the hotel can absorb him into it, it can have it, but it can't personally kill him. It needs Jack to do the work for it. But if it can do all this extra crap, why can't it just kill Danny?
I think Stephen King reminds me of Dickens in that he writes amazing beginnings and amazing settings. I wouldn't have thought of those two. This is the first time someone's compared the two. He sets up amazing situations, but about 3/4 of the way through the book, you can tell he's got his eye on the next book. And in Dickens's case, this was literal. He would be writing the last chapters of one book while he was writing the first chapters of his next to appear in magazines. So he would actually be publishing them concurrently and simultaneously. And that's what Stephen King. I love the story about him writing Cujo during one of his
that's a great story.
Alcoholic moments, and he just completely forgets.
He was like, I don't even remember writing this book. Which, by the way, considering how long it is, he probably wrote it in 6 days.
And it's actually a pretty good book. I think it's a really effective, nasty thriller,
Yeah, I liked it. It was I think that one works a little bit better than some of his ones because it focuses more on the melodrama of the bad marriage, the mom. Of course, I related to it because it had a scary dog in it. See the scar I got here? This is from a dog. Yeah, when I was 3.5 years old, an Afghan hound tried to rip my face off.
Jeez. Oh, now I could see Cujo being a bit triggering in that case.
Yeah, but I love dogs, weirdly, even big ones. But I agree, Cujo was pretty fun. I mean, I would not consider Mr. King to be a first-rate writer, but he's got talent. I think sometimes it's like maybe he should just slow it down, think it through.
A couple more rereads, couple more
Right,
redraft the story a little bit.
right. Like again, like both De Palma and Kubrick, they worked those films over. Like De Palma worked on that film for over a year before he was even able to get it done. So he spent so much more time working on that story than King did. I mean, King, I think, he was teaching at the time and he wrote a draft of what was teaching, and then over his Christmas break, added on all this extra stuff that made it long enough to be a novel, which of course then De Palma took all of that out. He just wanted the story of Carrie.
Yeah, and you're really good in you sort of tracing the sort of genesis of Carrie and actually how Carrie White is based on. I think you say two people that Stephen King knew,
Yeah.
although sort of two conveniently dead people, so that no one
Right,
could
exactly.
check.
And he changes a little. Like I don't know if you noticed from my thing that I had fun showing how he changes the story all the time because he's a novelist that wants to tell a good story. So, but yes, he claimed in one version that one of the girls was based on a student he went to school with, and she turns up in another one of his novels from that time period too. And then the other one was supposed to be a student that he had. And yeah, one of them, in one version of the story, she hung herself. In another version, she shot herself.
They go to a different school. You don't know them.
Exactly. The main important thing, I think, is that they are, whether they're real or not, they're expressions of King's sense of his own not fitting in. Because, again, like one thing people have never noticed is that he gave Carrie his own birthday.
So it's a self-portrait as well.
I think so, even though he tried to kind of deny that. He changed his views on her. Like, originally, he claimed that she was a good person who was used by everyone and pushed to the point that she went to. And then later, he started saying that he never liked this character. And then she was like one of the Columbine people almost.
Yeah, which is funny because one of his Richard Bachman books, I think it's called Rage.
That has a version of one of those girls in it.
Oh, okay, that's where it connects, yeah, and that is definitely that's a school shooter. Goes into holds his classmates conscious. It really does not read well anymore, that book. I read it a couple of years ago.
He pulled it from publication after Columbine.
Because it's so directly a kind of sympathetic portrayal of somebody who's essentially a school shooter.
Yeah, one of the school shooters, only it's a male one. I think it's interesting, too, the change of, instead of having a male rage-filled school shooter, I think it's interesting his change of gender and then making it more about this kind of ambivalent sense of needing to fit in and not being able. You know what I mean? A girl needs to be pretty, but when she is pretty, then she's just, buying into all the BS conventions of what being a girl is supposed to be.
Just to circle back a second to that idea of him sharing the birthday with Carrie, in a way, to me, and this being his first novel, it feels like it is a perfect symbol of what a young writer is like, in that you sort of walk around destroying everybody you hate with your mind.
Yeah, he went way further with the destruction than the movie does. That's another thing that's different about is that he loves to pour on the destruction.
In your book, you explain the genesis of the actual movie and how Brian De Palma gets involved. And one of the brilliant things I think about this period is that there are these movies that we absolutely identify a director with. So Carrie is absolutely quintessentially a De Palma movie. Taxi Driver is quintessentially a Scorsese movie, and all the Apocalypse Now quintessentially. But all of those films had different directors. George Lucas was going to do Apocalypse Now. Taxi Driver, I can't remember who was going to do that, but there was
De Palma thought about it.
De Palma, exactly, yes, and
he was up for Cruising as well.
Right, yes, Friedkin's film, yeah. So there's this sort of musical chairs going on, which is just like fantasy, a Hollywood fantasy of what would that have looked like,
They considered Ken Russell for Carrie, which I think he would have been an interesting choice. The closest they thought of Roman Polanski, I think, was Kubrick asked for that? No, Kubrick was asked for The Exorcist, right?
I think so, yes.
And you know that the producer of Carrie had originally been the producer on The Exorcist. And his name's Paul Monash. And he tried to wrest stuff away from William Friedkin, who didn't like it. And so William Friedkin got him kicked off that project. And so one of the actresses claimed that that De Palma wouldn't let Stephen King on the set of the movie while he was making Carrie. And he denied that that was the case. But then again, he denied things that he did do. But I don't know about that. And I wondered if maybe it was Paul Monash who didn't want King on the set because of how Peter Blatty had treated him.
Right, right. So he just had an allergy to writers at that point.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I would, as someone who's interviewed Brian De Palma, I would definitely say take everything he says with a very large pinch of salt. I remember I asked him about the Giallo, as an influence on his work, Dario Argento's sort of
because of Dress to Kill.
Yeah, exactly. And the film that he was promoting was the one with Rachel McAdams and
Passion.
Exactly. And it's very Giallo. It's got split screens. It's got black.
Yeah. I thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was like,
the weird masks.
Exactly. And it was sort of like, and he premiered it in Venice. So I was like, oh, is it nice to be in Venice, sort of the home, Italy, the home of the Giallo, with this sort of neo Giallo. And he said, I've never seen a Giallo.
Well, that's a lie.
I know, but it's such a brazen lie. It's almost like he's testing you. It's almost like he's saying, do you want some of me? Do you want some of this?
Yeah, I've heard lots of people. I hadn't ever thought to think of him in connection to Giallo until I started reading people saying that they thought Dress to Kill was like a Giallo. Because if you read his description of his influences, he has specifically picked Buñuel as his influence for that movie. Which at first I was like, Buñuel, why him? And then I realized when I saw Belle de Jour that that's what he was talking about. Where he just took the main character from that, who's the wife and then the prostitute, and split her into two different characters who are sort of pulled together, and then mixed it with Psycho.
De Palma gets involved with the, after this merry-go-round of different names, gets involved with the making of Carrie, and as you say, he's preparing this film for quite a long period.
Like a year, yeah.
Yeah. What takes so long? What's involved with that process?
Okay, so the two things I got were that it was financing, and he was trying. One of the reasons is that he was trying to tell them it was going to cost like $1.7 million, and they wanted him to bring it in $1.5 million. And he says that he told them $1.7 million, and so they were like, "Well, see you, sir. That's fine." And so then he just went and told them what they wanted, and then they got some kind of tax shelter to eventually finance the movie, and then the financing finally came through. But during that time, he was casting it, and famously that he was working with George Lucas, who was casting Star Wars at the same time. So he got the runoff people that Lucas didn't want. Right, like Amy Irving had tried out for Princess Leia. I think she would have been a great Princess Leia. And what's her name? Carrie Fisher was tried out for Carrie White.
What point does Sissy Spacek enter the picture? Because again, in now we see Carrie and we think it could be nobody else.
Like, who else could it be?
Yeah.
Okay, so there were two art directors on the show. I had William Kinney and Jack Fisk, although it was really pretty much Jack Fisk. And Fisk is like one of the great art directors for films. Like he did Badlands, which is where he met Sissy Spacek and they got married. And he also, like you've seen Eraserhead, right? Well, Fisk is the man in the machine that we see in that movie. And the two of them, when they did their regular movies, Carrie probably helped finance Eraserhead, which I think is also one of the amazing things about that movie. So Fisk designed, have you seen Phantom of the Paradise?
Yes. Yeah, the musical.
Okay, so Fisk designed that. And Sissy Spacek helped him because she didn't have anything going on at the time. And she almost got the role, or was at least up for the role that Jessica Harper played. But weirdly, they didn't think she could sing, which is weird because she'd actually begun as a country singer, and before she came onto it. So anyway, Jack Fisk was pushing Sissy Spacek at De Palma, and she was up for several of the roles. Like one of the roles, she was almost up for Nancy Allen's role, playing the bitchy character. But De Palma didn't think she quite fit that, and she really wanted to be that. So she just kept haranguing him about being Carrie and. Put Vaseline in her hair and dressed like as dowdy as she thought Carrie should be for it. And I'm not sure what, okay. De Palma says that I forget the name of the woman they originally were going to have for Carrie. she kind of got erased from the history of the movie. I guess
Mm.
because Sissy Spacek was up for an Oscar, so it was kind of weird to bring her up. But when they compared their two tryouts, Sissy Spacek just, according to De Palma, wiped the floor with the other actresses, and so he knew she was the one, and pushed. Supposedly, he told me the studios were a little iffy about taking her, but I couldn't get out of when I talked to the studio people why. They claimed that they didn't interfere with the United Artists didn't interfere with those kind of decisions with the film as long as they were within budget, but that's not true from they did interfere and stuff like that. But anyway, so they let Sissy Spacek do it.
I can't believe. I think films in studios tend to interfere with stuff regardless of budget. I mean, I think one thing that I've noticed is that often if a studio is distracted with another big production, then that's the time you'll get let alone. I think Raging Bull, there's some story about the studio having real problems with another big budget production, so it was like Raging Bull just flew under the wire. It wasn't on their radar at all, so Scorsese could just do what he liked. So the opening of Carrie is one of the most striking and a girl having her period in the shower and the sort of brutality and all the rest of it, especially coming from a filmmaker who often gets cast as a sort of misogynist or someone who delights in filming women in peril, or lasciviously, if you wish. How did that sort of come about? Did De Palma have a lot of pushback in that with that scene?
It's interesting that you ask that because, like, one of the things I thought about that scene is I think that may be the first time that they've ever shown that's ever been shown graphic menstruation. You know what I mean? I don't think that's ever appeared in American films before. Maybe in European art movies or something. I haven't come across it. So I did ask the vice president at United Artists about this, and she said they were worried about it, but she didn't say much more. She didn't seem to want to talk very much. So, but weirdly, it was a very cheap film, though. Even at the time, it was a very low budget film, and United Artists had a lot, like you were saying before, they had bigger productions going on that year. Like, what was the name of that movie that was about the folk singer who actually comes from my state, but I can't remember his name now. But there was a giant big production.
Bound to Heaven, the Woody Guthrie.
Yes. Yes, the Woody Guthrie movie was really their big thing. And so his movie was just considered, like, De Palma was a little bit bitter about how he felt like his movie was just considered a trashy horror movie.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, nowadays you would think of Carrie as one of the prime candidates for lifting the genre into Oscar nominations and things like that, which you don't usually get for horror films.
No, and I often call it the Citizen Kane of horror movies.
Yeah, right. There you go.
Which you can do. It literally has references to Citizen Kane.
It seems to be the most filmy of films in that De Palma sort of throws every technique he has, including the kitchen sink, quite literally at the screen.
Yeah, he took everything he felt he had been learning over the past several years and used it in the film. But one thing that's like not true, like the British Film Institute and a few British critics that I read in general seem to feel that the movie was only like all style and it didn't relate thematically. But the way I analyzed it, it seemed to me that all the styles and technical things, built in a thematic way, even like the split screen that you see at the prom is like built out of all of these split perspectives that he's constantly showing and your split understanding of Carrie's situation, because we know a lot more than she does.
Right.
As things build. And I felt like his style like brings it out. And it's interesting because he uses almost an expressionistic style, but the sets and stuff aren't weird like in the expressionist film. So there's a realism to it at the same time that it's very stylized.
Yeah, oddly, there's a kind of almost sort of documentary element to, you feel like they're living in real environments. You feel like the school is actually a school.
Yes, it was a school.
Right, well, there you go.
And in fact, one thing I want to point out before we lose this is one of the things that's interesting and I think accidentally adds an interesting stylistic element to the movie is that De Palma used two different cinematographers. Like he fired his first cinematographer, Isidore Mankowski, I believe. Is that guy's name? And he does all the stuff you see of the girls in the school at first. And De Palma didn't like it the way that he was filming the girls, and he didn't think it made them look attractive enough, even though it's silly, they're gorgeous. But the interesting thing is then when he got a second cinematographer, I can't remember that guy's name. I'm sorry, guys. That guy uses much richer, more saturated colors, and all the stuff at Carrie's house has more of that guy's texture to it. So you get this like realistic school setting, and then this gothic home setting. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so I think that creates an interesting effect, I think.
And the Gothic sort of home setting, as you say, is much more stylized. Mario Tosi was the director who came in. And Pino Donaggio, of course, does the music, and he's a brilliant Italian composer, probably aware of his music for Don't Look Now, one of the...
Yes, that was how he got the role, was because Bernard Herrmann was supposed to do the music for Carrie, as he'd done for Sisters, but he died right after finishing his Taxi Driver music. And so De Palma didn't know who to go to, and a movie critic who worked at Time, I believe, that he was friends with, suggested Donaggio because of the music for Don't Look Now. And I think Donaggio's like maybe the best composer for De Palma because he's beautiful, like you said, but it's also like Donaggio also has an understanding of a kind of like corniness as well. And so he can bring some of that corniness into the movies, and it helps add to like a postmodern texture where De Palma wants you to pull you in, but makes fun of what you're seeing at the same time. Not as much in Carrie as in like Body Double, but in Body Double you can really see it.
I absolutely agree, and it goes straight back to what we were talking about in terms of the 70s. That corniness is absolutely on point. If I listened to a Pino Donaggio soundtrack in the 80s, I would be thinking, oh, this is way too syrupy, and but now listening to it, I think, oh, this is so wonderful, so evocative.
Or like the way he uses like electronic elements sometimes, or those breathy female choruses. It's very funny, but it works.
The school is set up, and you have a situation in which Carrie is being bullied as a response to her first period, which is an absolute nightmare. It takes a very real nightmare, very easily established nightmare, real world, I mean, and then extrapolates it into this revenge power fantasy that's going to come. But it progresses, and it's so Machiavellian. The girls who are plotting against her.
But what's interesting though is like again, it changed from like the way it is in the book and the way it was in the original script that Cohen wrote. The Irving character Sue Snell only joins the fray at the end just because the girls get going. But in the movie, when you watch it again and pay attention carefully, she's one of the first ones to initiate it, which changes like the moral meaning of the character. Because one of the things that De Palma would say, and it's interesting because so many critics like Kim Newman and others have taken the film to have an almost simplistic moralism. And I don't think that it does. And De Palma himself talked frequently that he considered it to be very relativistic, and that each of the characters was acting on what they thought was right, but it was all diametrically opposed. Like the mother seriously thinks that Carrie's power is evil and that she has to stop her, even though, that makes her kind of monstrous.
And the school kids are just being school kids, basically. They're not evil. They're certainly cruel, but that's kind of goes with the territory.
And it's important to remember, again, Amy Irving is doing what she thinks is right when she has her boyfriend take Carrie to the prom to make up for what she did. But that essentially initiates what leads to the deaths of everyone that she knows. And the gym teacher, Miss Collins, played wonderfully by Betty Buckley, she feels bad about the way she herself thinks about Carrie and tries to make up for it by really going hard on those girls, but it just has, the opposite effect ultimately. And that's what I think is so cool about the movie. Like, none of the other versions of Carrie have handled the gym teacher as ambivalently as De Palma's does. Like, she doesn't die in the book. She didn't die in the original screenplay. She doesn't die in any of the remakes. Only De Palma kills her in that horrible way.
I think that's actually a sort of absence of moralism in the sense that
Yes.
people get punished in a way which is utterly regardless and arbitrary. You know, it's regardless of their sins, they will get it either punished far too much, you know, disproportionately, or just punished when they haven't actually done anything wrong.
Yeah, and I think that De Palma's sort of using this whole high school thing as a kind of metaphor for like the system. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Because he comes out of that counterculture thing, and you have to remember the movie does the first like full scene in the movie is not actually the shower scene, but it's the overhead shot of the volleyball game. The girls are playing a volleyball game, and De Palma uses that as a metaphor for how the social politics of that high school are like a game. And then this movie is about what happens when you stop playing that game.
Yes, and what was sort of surprising as well is that you bring this up in the book. Some of the actors actually didn't think they were the baddies or they were doing anything particularly bad.
Nancy Allen, yeah, she thought of herself. She thought she and John Travolta were like the comic relief, and it wasn't until she saw the movie that she realized what a bitch she was in that movie, which is funny. And it's also one of the differences too, between the book and the movie is that in the book, her character has like 140 IQ, and whereas in the movie she seems very, very, dumb. She herself, I mean, Nancy Allen referred to her character as being kind of dumb.
One thing that shines out about both the movie and the way you describe it in the book is that it's really built around these very big set pieces, and especially the prom at the end.
Yes.
Even if you've not seen the movie, you've seen that part of the movie, either
Yes.
parodied or in some way referenced by other films. That the process of making that strikes me as the part of the movie where you see why Brian De Palma wanted to make the film.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's like the most surprising thing, and De Palma was straightforward with me about it, was when I had been researching the film, I read that he made reference to the bridge on the River Kwai, and how the scene with the bridge blows up is to him like this perfect symbol of all the different characters' perspectives, and how that too is a movie where each of the characters thinks they're doing the right thing, but it's diametrically opposed. And I had remembered that he talked a lot about Kubrick's Barry Lyndon when he made that movie Redacted. And when I saw it, I noticed that he used music from Barry Lyndon and has these shots that are just like some of the ones Kubrick did in that. So when I talked to De Palma, I asked him, I went back and rewatched The Bridge on the River Kwai, and I realized that the whole sequence where the bridge blows up is redone in the scene where Sue Snell sees the rope going up to the blood, and he basically redid that whole scene doing it with the blood. I mean, it's not that way in the screenplay. And I asked him, and he basically admitted that that was true, that he did rework the bridge blowing up. I was really surprised. And he said yes. And he said no to almost everything else.
It's such a strange parallel to have. It's so generically diverse.
Until you think about the way that like when you go back to the scene where Miss Collins, the gym teacher, is like punishing the girls, it is very martial and very military. And again, I think this hits his counterculture idea of the system. You know what I mean? So there is a sense that, yeah, I know you're like this movie about men in the military, and it doesn't seem to fit like this film about girls in high school. But I think it does. And he's using each of the different girls and Miss Collins' views of Carrie as like this, or sort of like reflected in the way this unfolds, because you have all their various perspectives. Like Miss Collins thinks that Sue is there to get at Carrie because Carrie's kissing Tommy, and not seeing the thing with the rope underneath the stage. And Sue Snell's just so happy at first until she realizes what's going on, and it takes on this weird nightmare perspective. Actually, like it better in his movie than the way that David Lean did it, and David Lean did it amazingly.
If you're going to steal off anybody, steal off the best.
Yeah, and everyone's always calling him a ripoff of Hitchcock, and I'm like, he rips off from everybody.
Absolutely.
Not just Hitchcock. There's Buñuel, there's Wells, David Lean, and I really feel like I'm the first person that ever found that David Lean thing. So I was very proud of myself.
And that final scene, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier as well about thinking of Carrie as the filmmaker or as the writer. The camera starts to be directed by Carrie. She's the one who seems to
Yes.
be, doing the swish pans and all the rest of it.
Yeah, because in the first part of the movie, Carrie is constantly shown in frames, and she's dominated by the frames, and she seems to be squashed by them in the beginning, and then by the time she gets to the prom, she's like controlling the frame, literally breaking the film frame in two, just with her gaze.
And directing the special effects. She's the one, look over there, look over here.
Yes, exactly. De Palma says now that he wishes he hadn't done the split screen in that sequence, but I'm like, thematically, it seems perfect. And I like this idea of, she looks on one side of the screen, and on the other side of the screen, it does the stuff she wants. It's really great, I think.
And thinking about the religious element and how Carrie sort of gets revenge on her mother, the sort of matricide, which is something else that you don't really see much. I mean, it is a replay, I suppose, of Psycho to some degree, but the dutiful daughter killing the mother, I can't think of many examples. Heavenly Creatures with Peter Jackson, Kate Winslet film.
That's a good one.
Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of the only one I can think of, really, of this particular crime.
Oh yeah, and also the bizarre way that she kills her mother, like she's Saint Sebastian. That's very weird. And Piper Laurie has an orgasm when she dies, which is very bizarre. And that was the actress's idea to do that.
The sexual root of religious frenzy.
Right, and it fits perfectly with the whole movie.
Yeah. What you're repressing comes back.
Yes, and just another film reference that, of course, apparently De Palma got the idea for that sort of from Throne of Blood, that Japanese filmmaker guy. What's his name?
Kurosawa.
Kurosawa's, yeah. When his version of Macbeth gets stuck with all these arrows, that gave him this idea for all those knives and kitchen utensils. But it's really nicely transformed because, of course, it's perfect that she gets killed with the implements of woman's work.
Yes, sort of the domestic.
Exactly. The sort of again, the repression. A lot of people think the movie's misogynistic, but to me, it seems like it's really making not so much because horror movies don't work in this way. A lot of people take them. They think that if you feel bad about what you're seeing, then the movie is saying that's wrong. Many film critics or reviewers at the time thought that Carrie having a bad time when she had her menstruation meant that De Palma himself thought menstruation was bad. And trying to remember, Kim Newman, I think, and several other critics from the time period believed that that De Palma was in some sense on the mom's side.
Yeah,
and I'm like, that's insane.
That's a very weird take.
Yes. But the thing is that what De Palma is doing, and what a good horror movie does, is it doesn't tell you that something is good or bad, but it pulls out your anxieties. You may be afraid about stuff like that, or you may, you don't want to think about girls menstruating. And so he plays with this, gross ick factor to bring out things that we think that we didn't realize we thought. Do you know what I mean? It's not a condemnation of that sort of thing, and it's not for it. It's it works you through it, I guess, is what I mean.
I think there's a lot to be said as well for visibility. Just the simple fact that we don't have any it's the 1970s, and this is the first time we see anything like this.
Yes,
you know what I mean. It's something which happens to women every month for
exactly,
a significant portion of their lives, and it's not. It's never portrayed. If it was happening to men, it would be, it would have its own genre.
And of course, it's important to note that it's this is something that was written, directed by guys. Stephen King wrote it, Cohen wrote the screenplay, and De Palma, directed Spacek how to act. She was how am I supposed to react to this? Because, as a woman, this just happens to her all the time. But De Palma's you need to be hit it's you're being hit by a Mack truck. So this is, to a certain degree, De Palma's dealing with like male anxieties about this as much as like what the woman feels. It kind of fuses together. Like that's why that scene is so sexy in general, building up to it. Like that's a woman would film that shower scene that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like this is bodies and this is also bodies.
And I think sort of like often when you read, I don't know if you've read very much film writing on horror films or academic feminist studies, have like had insights about how I think these kinds of movies work, but sometimes they go a slightly wrong. Like they think that these filmmakers hate women and that these are like sort of subtextual fantasies about the hostility men feel towards women because of their sexual power, and so that it's a way of like killing them for that, sort of in slasher films. But I think what maybe these women don't always understand is that we men often have ambivalent feelings about our sexuality, and that we desire something, but we also think we shouldn't desire something. And so these kinds of films at their best will play on our own fears of our desires as well as like evoking them. So there's as much guilt involved as the kind of misogyny they have. I felt like I had to kind of like separate myself from feminists in general because they really didn't like De Palma very much, and I really like it.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think there is a way there is a feminist reading of Carrie, and I think there's a feminist reading of a lot of De Palma's work. I mean, De Palma's always been like this, hasn't he? I mean, remember his racial politics. His first films were extremely sort of provocative, and they were in your face.
Yes, but the thing is, like, it's not. Again, like a good movie isn't just like I feel this way about something. It's like you can have several feelings at once, and the ambivalences are a big part of like what's true about something, right? So it's like you can be feminist, but you can, because like Stephen King talked about how he felt like his book Carrie was a male's reaction to the advent of women's liberation. That it was like it's a good thing, but he also felt that he also had fears and anxieties about what that might take away from him. I think the movie is less like that, but that it's not wrong to try to dramatize that ambivalence. Like sometimes you get the feeling from feminists that you shouldn't dramatize the problems, but by dramatizing the problems, that's where you see them.
Absolutely. I think it's in the nature of ideology generally to narrow the world, and it's the dynamic of art is to broaden the world and to make things more nuanced and complicated. And so within that, there's always going to be a tension between ideology and art. I think there's always going to be the best art should make everybody uncomfortable. It shouldn't just be about making you feel, yep, I totally agree with that.
Right. And think about like of all of the film brats that De Palma was films with George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Coppola, like none of them made a film about women the way that this is. Like this is all about women. I mean, it's like strong women having moral, ethical decisions. It treats what happens to the girls like it actually matters.
Yeah. Passes the Bechdel test.
Yeah, and it's like, well, I mean, a lot of it is over dating, but yeah, it's like the Amy Irving's trying to do the right thing. Betty Buckley's just such a strong, liberated woman kind of character. I, I, I don't know. I've always thought that. I mean, like Martin Scorsese's, all their movies seem to be mostly about guys for the most part, and it's kind of ironic that De Palma liked doing films about women, but because of the way he did them, he felt pushed out of doing that.
How do you rate the sort of the impact of Carrie? Or I mean, you referenced earlier the recent remake, not particularly recent remake, but that seemed
like 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that seemed to come and go without touching the sides.
Yeah, because again, like one problem is they're using actors who are the right age. One of the good things about De Palma's version is they're all like in their mid-20s, so he can do what he needs to do with them where it comes to nudity and graphicness. Whereas you can't do that with Chloe Grace Moretz because she was like 16 when she did that movie. So all of like the sexual aspects of Carrie are pretty much those punches are all pulled in the remake. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing like in the opening when she has her period. I think she has her period in a swimming pool, so you can't even see it. And then The thing where she kills her mom is just none of that stuff has any kind of impact because they don't want to be anti-religious either. Whereas, De Palma went all the way into Buñuel territory.
It's so fascinating how something that's more recent feels more old-fashioned.
Yes, it's weird. And I don't know how to explain it, but for the most part, movies have gotten a lot more. I guess because like you can see pornography so easily on the internet that maybe people don't feel like they need to see sex in movies as much. I'm not sure why.
Would you be interested in taking another film and giving it this kind of attention? Because I think you do a brilliant job here. I'd love to see you do another book like this.
I mean, my favorite film is Taxi Driver. I would love to, and there's stuff about that movie that's never come out before, but it's been so written about. I'm not sure that it would be something that someone was up for. Maybe that's possible. That something like I might like to do something like that. But generally speaking, I tend to write fiction. I'm a fiction writer.
Right. What genre of fiction are you writing?
Well, I mean, it's like not really. I mean, I generally, I guess it would be considered sort of literary-ish, but I have been working on like a really giant paranoid occult horror story for a long time. I thought it would be interesting to take something like The Fury. You've seen The Fury, right? Palma movie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I thought a story like that or Firestarter or what was that one that Cronenberg did? Scanners,
Yes. Yeah.
Take a story like that and do it, but then like research it like a historical novel. So I've got all of this research on the history of intelligence and war, and just I've probably read 100 books researching this book, but it's still in an exploitation style. Yeah, but it involves like a government and occult and monster shit. But it's funny. The more research I did on all the creepy crap that our government has done in experiments, the more I began to feel I wasn't going far enough.
Last question, Joe. What would be a recommended film book that our listeners could go and explore?
Okay, I thought about this. You want just one? Is that what you said?
You could, yeah. You can have more than one. Everyone does.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say, since you and I had an exchange about Lolita not too long ago, I was thinking about a book by Alfred Apple Jr., who's an academic, called Nabokov's Dark Cinema, which is a really interesting book where he sort of examines Nabokov's novels in terms of the tricks and tropes that he used in films by talking about a lot of real films. And this kind of comes back to what we're talking about because he talks about the movie Sisters, and he says that he thinks that Sisters is the most Nabokovian of movies, which I thought was interesting. And it's really good. So that would be a movie book I would do. And also Ken Newman, his book on his BFI monograph on cat people is wonderful. It was one of the influences I had for how to deal with all the information. And it's just a terrific book. Those are my two. And his Nightmare Movies is interesting. He's real hard on De Palma in it.
Yeah, he has his likes and his dislikes in that book.
And he revised it, and in his footnotes, he comes back a little easier on De Palma. So it sort of follows what you were saying before about how people are finally coming around back to thinking De Palma's kind of good.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be interesting when we get to. I mean, I don't want to hurry things along or anything, but I think as these movie brats sort of reach the end of their careers and lives, it'll be interesting to see where the cards fall because I feel that there'll be, just the same way Cimino's been somewhat rediscovered in recent years. I've got a feeling people like De Palma, they might rise.
Maybe. I mean, it seems like over Lucas, at least, because it's like, you don't really think of Lucas as being a great filmmaker. You think of him as being the creator of the greatest blockbuster of all time.
Which is a pity because THX 1138 is great, and American Graffiti I have a lot of time for.
Oh, that was him. Okay, I haven't seen THX 1138. But yeah, American Graffiti is pretty good. Although, again, this is a movie where you can see that the women haven't been as well written as they should be.
Good point. Yeah, I haven't seen it for years. I imagine it might have aged a little bit.
Yeah, because what's her name? The one who was on Laverne and Shirley, what's her name, who just recently died? I'm terrible with all these names, but she's fantastic. And you really feel like she should have gotten more to her part than it gets.
Do you mean Cindy Williams?
Yeah, Cindy Williams. She's so good in it.
Yeah, no, I agree about that sort of boys' club aspect of the movie brats as well. That they weren't necessarily the they didn't necessarily have the broadest view of life when it came to sex and 51% of the world's population.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I get it. Like with someone like Scorsese is trying to like explore, issues of masculinity, and I actually do think that he did a good job with the women in Taxi Driver. Like, Sybil Shepherd, I think is really terrific, especially when you compare what Schrader wanted her to be in the screenplay. Like, she's made it much more interesting in the film than she is in the screenplay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The screenplay characterizes her quite abhorrently.
Yeah, it's very important. Like, I mean, he uses obscene language to describe her.
Well, listen, Joe, thanks so much for talking to me about Carrie. It's given me an opportunity to rewatch the film, and I learned so much reading it. I love the way you just do this sort of the whole stretch of from the Stephen King genesis to the influences towards the end. A really good panorama of the film.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad that you wanted to talk to me.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale, and today I'm going to be talking to Joseph Eisenberg, who has written a fascinating study on Brian De Palma's Stephen King adaptation, Carrie. We'll be going into the film quite deeply and into the book. It is available on Kindle if you follow the link in the show notes. I also wanted to mention that over the next month or so, I'm going to be very busy with film festivals. I'm going to a bunch of them, covering them for Variety and other outlets. So I shall be, maybe the time of the podcast will slip a little bit. If by any chance there are gaps, I'm going to try and plug them by reissuing some old episodes, which I don't think have had the love that they deserve. So apologies for that in advance, although if you haven't listened to the old episodes, you might be quite relieved of the opportunity to have a chance to catch up on something you haven't had an opportunity to listen to before. I'd like to thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood as ever for the artwork, and thank you, listener, for listening. But before you go, listen to our conversation with me and Joseph Eisenberg.